Good morning. My name is Stephen Shaw, and I'm the Community Engagement Director at Verizon. And we are so pleased to be a part of this system conference and presenting this panel on the intersection of STEM and gaming. Uh, a lot of people think about gaming and they think about video games. I can think about some of the ones I played when I was a kid, like Pac-Man and others. But now there's becoming an increasing tie between the education industry and the gaming industry. And we want to explore some of that this afternoon. To do that, I am very pleased to be moderating a panel with some industry experts that span gaming as well as game, sports, and education. And so I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel to you. First, we have Erica Davis. Erica works for a company called Experis, and specifically within the Experis gaming division. And Experis really looks at quality control, quality testing, and testing solutions for game developers. And so it's great to have her and her industry experience on the panel. Next, we have Dr. Krista Lee Malone. Krista Lee is on faculty at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and she not only teaches, but she is over the gaming certificate. And so that just gives you a sense that, gaming is in higher ed and is something that you can study. And she's going to talk more about that during the panel. And we also have from the K-12 space, we have Wendell Willis. Wendell is the executive director of Public Schools Education Foundation. And so he has both an education and a business background, and is a great person to kind of talk about not only what's going on in the Milwaukee ecosystem, but kind of how education and how gaming can be integrated on a holistic level. And then finally, we have Brandon Thatcher, who is the founder and the head of the Milwaukee eSports Alliance, which is an alliance of organizations specifically geared towards increasing not only the popularity, but increasing the inclusivity of gaming and esports, and really making gaming and esports, making Milwaukee, the Milwaukee region, a destination. So we are happy to have Brandon here on the panel today. So now that we've introduced everyone, let's kick it off. So again, this is a STEM conference, and so let's start with the very basics. And I'll start with you, Wendell. Can you talk about how STEM itself has been integrated into the curricula of schools, whether it be project-based or how it's being integrated into various disciplines and various classes, and then talk about how gaming and the gamification of certain curricula have been used to enhance these STEM experiences?
So for us in K-12, we are always looking for how we can engage students differently. We all used to sit in a classroom and be kind of lectured at all day. And we know while that may have worked, it was not the best way, it was not the most engaging way or inspiring method, right? So looking at all the methodology of inspiring students to be hands-on, want to be part of that learning, but also challenge them in the problem solving. We've got so many different methods that we're using. So we talk just STEM in general. The first piece is building some labs, offering fab labs, offering 3D printers, all of those kind of cool and sexy tools that none of us had as kids that we're building in the classroom, but also giving them problems to really solve and saying, okay, if today we're going to put you in the classroom with a professional in a hospital, here's what they're solving. Or someone from GE Healthcare, here's a challenge they've got. You could work on that side by side with them. One of our great partnerships is with Rockwell. They come in weekly to an elementary school. They're doing projects with students, which led them to actually saying, we can't keep doing these projects in the sterile classroom environment. We're going to be doing an actual lab that's the right place to do that work. So that's where we're moving things, is towards getting that hands-on experience with the labs that match curriculum, that match inspirations.
Perfect segue, Wendell, and thank you, because you talked about some of the career pathways, and so I'd like to go to Erica and then to Brandon, because gaming and esports Yeah, it's a billion-dollar industry and growing, and you have millions of people around the, not around the country, around the world who are gaming. And so, Erica, when you look at uh, what are, how should we be training and pipelining some of our youth to make sure that they are prepared to go into careers in gaming?
We think about early STEM education, and there are some basics that are starting to get introduced into classrooms even now, thinking about some very fundamentals of computer science. That sounds big, it sounds scary, it sounds like a barrier to entry, and yet you think about it like learning a language. We know that kids are primed to learn new languages. How about we think about kids being primed to learn about, think like a computer, think like an NPC. How would they respond to this situation? And teaching them to write those kinds of responses. They start writing those responses, maybe on paper, maybe in a document, and then they learn the languages that they would need to write those responses in a more complicated way as they progress in their education and towards a career path. And that's just a start, thinking in a very STEM focused sort of way. But there are other basics like root cause investigation, incredibly important in the QA testing industry. And it's something that students learn in multiple disciplines in project-based learning, whether they're investigating for a history project, how did this come about, or in math or science. And then, really important, hopefully for every career, hopefully for every student, is a love of learning. And that's not something that we teach in classrooms, that's something we foster, hopefully in our education spaces, in building, like Wendell was just talking about, spaces where students, especially older students, but any students, can define their own space and feel comfortable and safe in their learning environment. Thinking about ways to teach that aren't just everyone sits and learns the same thing at the same time. Hearing about that, I was reminded of, for example, Montessori style education, children who can choose their own work materials and spend that time where they focus on understanding everything about what they're learning and that root cause investigation because they love it. And those things are, part of STEM education, part of a healthy education in general, and when followed and pursued, can lead towards all kinds of careers in the games industry, whether those are in QA and testing, development, design, or off of those STEM paths like marketing, you were saying, production management, tasking out the way things are going to be built, the way things are going to be managed and envisioned for the future. There are careers across the space following those types of tracks.
Brandon, I can see you, Brandon, you're smiling, so go ahead, because I know this is something that's right up your alley as well.
Well, it is, and I get excited when Wendell talks about the Twilight Center. I get excited about knowing the work that he's doing with MPS and the incredible kids that they have going through those teams that he mentioned. And then it gets piggybacked by someone like Erica, who we're super excited for Experience Gaming's expansion here in Milwaukee. Hearing her over time talk about the way that they bring in, people who are green in their tech or IT careers and then develop them into highly valued and coveted employees and being able to provide a service. So just the back-to-back there is probably what had me smiling the most. The pathways side, to me, it's an intriguing conversation. I think there's a lot of technical things, a lot of stuff like what Krista Lee is developing in her student body and what UW-Madison is working through. As a sports, I'll say a traditional sports aficionado all of my life, I think a very interesting comparison when you talk about career growth is just thinking about the fact that esports to some degree is within its first 10 or 20 years, and that could be academically debated, but to the large majority, it's within its infancy. And if you look at sports like basketball, football, really any of the North American large four, you see in those instances all of the jobs that are wrapped around sort of that sports competition environment. And this will be much the same. You already see it starting to develop, whether it's in the K through 12 environment. The collegiate space is certainly picking it up in the way that they're starting to involve their programs and facilities. And so I always think that just at the most minimal level, if you compare the growth of a major sporting industry or group, that's going to follow that path too. So, Erica mentioned marketing, production, event management, facility management, there's all of that there. And so that in and of itself would be its own industry. But yeah, the IT comparable, the STEM comparable is really exciting right now. because it's a pipeline. And that's been something that's probably been the most illustrative to me, is that as we've been working at the Alliance on things like workforce development programs and talent development ideas, when I started getting really excited was when all these employers all of a sudden said, sign us up. That's great. We need people in those spaces. And I thought, oh boy, we really found something special here. And then I was quickly reminded, like, yeah, there's a tech shortage and problem everywhere. So yeah, they'll take your folks. But what I do think is really unique is that the pipeline esports and competitive gaming can deliver is there. It is truly a space that is let's say explored to a degree that many others have been. And so I think that's where there can be really true excitement, is that this is, 12 to 17, 98% of kids are gaming. So we're going to be able to find the individuals in that space and hopefully bring them in a way that's authentic. And so it's very exciting.
That was a perfect handoff to Dr. Malone. So Crystal Lee, can you talk about, so we've gone from the basic STEM within the K-12 space, we've bridged that to workforce, but often there's a transition there, and that transition is generally the higher ed space. And so, Crystal Lee, since you're in that space, can you talk to us about what you see as some good preparatory steps so that youth can be prepared to go into college and look at a gaming concentration, or in some cases a gaming major? And then can you talk about specifically your program at UW-Madison?
A lot of what I'm going to say is really going to sound like what everyone before me said. And because I agree with all of you, right? And STEM education is very important. And I love when I hear about how more and more is being incorporated in K through 12, because then I know that when those students come to me, that they have that background and I don't have to do it, right? Because sometimes I have to do more background foundation than I'd like to before I can get to actual like game design, for example, which is the main thing that I teach. And also along those lines, I would say more of a problem than that is getting students to just know about these opportunities, right? So everyone's been talking about how there's all sorts of different jobs, right? And if you talk about esports, my freshmen coming in know about esports players, right? But they don't know about the people who are building those computers, building those chairs, building those setup, right? Because we have a world now where people are specifically building for esports, right? The arenas, the community managers, the agents, all of these other people that are really unseen, right? Nobody thinks about this, right? And it matters because I will have students who will often come in, especially freshmen and sophomores, and they'll say like, yeah, I'm taking your class because I'm interested in games, but I'm not going to take, a major, I'm not going to take a certificate because, and it's always something like, I can't code or I'm not a good player. And I'm like, but there's so many other things that you can do. And there's so many skills that are needed, right? Like it is not just, you cannot make a game having a room full of coders. You also can't make a game with a room full of designers or a room full of anything. You need such a wide variety of skill sets and expertise to come in and make a successful game, to make a successful esports team, right? Like if you have a room full of just people who are really good at playing, well, who's going to manage that team? Who's going to get them where they need to go, right? It's not going to be them. They need somebody else to do that. They need a different skill set. And so that has been the big thing that I have been trying to, like, aside from the just teaching the actual topics, is that I've been trying to really introduce my students to all of these jobs. But then I will say, to bring this back to the STEAM education, and this is something honestly I learned the hard way when I was in industry. So I did work as a designer before I was teaching in college, and I didn't have a very strong STEM background. And so even though I assume I did well at my job, I never got fired, the game went out. But I sometimes had communication issues with some of the programmers and developers because I didn't have that background to always know what they were saying or how to communicate what I needed to communicate, right? And so one of the things I'll tell my students is if they're interested in design or if they're interested in some of those types of gaming careers, is even if you don't want to be developer, just take like one class. You don't have to be an expert programmer or developer to just get the foundations of the tech so that you can have those conversations, because it'll make your job more efficient.
I appreciate how you talked about the myriad disciplines and fields that are incorporated within gaming, because it's not just the coders who do, who create, the architecture for the game itself, but just like any other pursuit, any other industry, once it's created, there must be distribution, there must be marketing, there must be sales. There's a communications aspect, and so what I've heard you say, Erica say, well, pretty much what everyone has said, that I really want the audience to really grab a hold of is, it's not just about, so if your child is, it's not just about playing the games, but whatever your skill or specialty, where you might have some type of kind of natural gifts and talents, you can probably apply that somewhere in the gaming or somewhere in the esports ecosystem. So I want to make sure that point gets, people really get that point. Now it's interesting to get to you and be able to take classes from Dr. Malone at Madison or anywhere else. It helps if you can get, transition from the K-12 space with a scholarship. And Wendell and Brandon, especially because not only do the two of you know each other, you've both been in this space. Talk about how you can position students to get scholarships. And then Brandon, you and I have talked about something that you're working on to bring a lot of these possible scholarship opportunities together. But Wendell, talk about how you can position some of the students who might be interested in gaming. How can you position them for scholarships?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. For us, there are many pathways to do that, but what we find the easiest, right, is our young people that are in those Twilight Centers expressing interest in computer science class, or even when they're not in those classes per se. We have over 20 college and career centers in our high schools. So that's where a lot of that work starts, right? The professionals we have in there that are day-to-day. Also, we have partners that come in there and fill out and round out where we don't have professionals that can be in there. So as they're talking with our young people saying, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Now, how are you going to fund that post-secondary? What does it look like? Because we want you leaving, you filled out your FAFSA, but let's not have as much debt. Yes, they said you can finance this, but you have to have something to pay for the financing on the back end. It's not completely free money. It's only free for 4 years or whatever you're going to be there for. So that's where the conversation really starts. And one of the pieces that we've tried to be more competitive is looking at our suburban counterparts and saying, watch how all these parents are starting to hire coaches to help their students play esports to become better or be in the field to attain and attach those scholarships. So not wanting to be left behind, we brought in that same type of influence into the district to say, okay, who are our champions? Who can we connect?
I liked what you touched on, Wendell, around the way that you could observe at the moment how other districts and how other places are starting to create their pipelines and create their ways to getting students access to these opportunities. And I think, as an organization for us, the Alliance, we're trying to do that in a macro level for the region, Milwaukee, Madison, Southern Wisconsin, and to some degree the state, because it's a big game. It's happening across the country where these scholarships and these opportunities are starting to be formed. And so, you had asked, Stephen, kind of one of the things we're working on. I'll mention maybe that first, because I think it's indicative of some of the opportunity. But what are starting to form around the country are what are called combines. And again, it follows a very typical sports model of how do you find out who can go play collegiate football at Alabama, where you run a combine and you find out who's the biggest, the fastest, who can perform. Well, similar in esports, these are starting to happen around the country where you bring in students from around the region, oftentimes right now multi-state because they're not super prevalent, mostly held on the coasts, but opportunities where individuals come in and play up to a select number of titles to compete, win scholarship money as well as prize money. And then universities attend these events to try and find who their next scholarship recipient is going to be, or who can join the team. And so we're very bullish on the opportunity we're trying to present here coming up in 2022, spring of 2022, where we're going to try to hold the region's first eSports recruiting combine. And I think the really exciting thing about that is not just it's being held, but I think the opportunity, you touched on it right at the beginning, Stephen, the opportunity for inclusivity and diversity and access is so cool with esports, because I mean, I grew up playing basketball. We probably grew up all playing sports, right? You know where you're going to go, depending on maybe what you were given in your DNA. Like, I was never going to play Alabama football. Wasn't going to happen. But you know what? Anyone can play esports at any socioeconomic level, at any height, weight, gender, race. And so we're really excited about the opportunity. What is missing in so many cases is just the professionalism aspect. And Wendell touched on this too, creating the pipeline, creating the environment where you can start to have some of these things be seen in a standard way, so you can have some comparables and see who's competing and winning at the best. And so, yeah, we're working on that event right now. Again, they're happening across the country and they're starting to gain momentum. But that's one way. And then, you know, for universities, and I think maybe Krista Lee can speak to this to some degree, probably more as well, but I know from the folks in the Alliance in Southern Wisconsin who we do get a chance to connect with, this is an enrollment opportunity as well. I mean, they see this as a growing way to connect and bring in new student populations to engage with their university. And scholarships are a great way to extend that opportunity to come and be a part of the university. And so that has been gaining an incredible amount of momentum. So to me, as an observer, you've got kind of a very interesting dynamic forming on both levels. You've got K through 12, you know, schools looking and seeing this growing interest. You've got universities saying, we're going to start to invest in this more and bring people in. And coincidentally, you've got people on the back end, employers, leading employers like Experis Gaming saying, yes, please. You know, so it's just a very interesting ecosystem to watch as all this forms, because it's like, we better not all screw this up, right? Because most of these are younger folks, and we're all the people kind of helping dictate what's going to happen in these important spaces. So very intriguing to kind of watch it all play out.
And Krista Lee, I'd like to bring this back to you because not only from the higher ed perspective, but I love what both Brandon and Wendell talked about in terms of how inclusive can be. And to some extent, it is inclusive because there are probably people across every demographic. As a matter of fact, to a lot of parents' chagrin, they're probably kids who they think are playing too many video games. So this is a good message for parents that, you know, your child is not just wasting his or her time. There are market opportunities here. But because you have so many students playing, how can you increase the inclusivity in the formal gaming or the formal esports industry? Because if you look at these, whether it's tournaments or you see, you know, HBO sports specials, you still associate gaming, at least the professionalized gaming that Brandon and Wendell were talking about, as a white male dominated industry. But we know that we have kids across various ethnic, cultural backgrounds playing. So what is it we can do to make the formal gaming space as inclusive as we know the informal gaming space is? And so Dr. Malone and Erica, because we are fortunate to have two women on this gaming panel. So we definitely want to take advantage of their expertise and lived experience.
Yeah, so actually this is a very important question, and it is exceptionally critical right now, because esports is not very old and it's not very established. So if we can take care of this now, it'll be a lot easier. If we try to go back later, it is going to be that much harder. And a lot of this does have to do with visibility. The fact that this panel is not all men and that is not all white, it is extremely important. Even if no kid sees this, there is some adult that sees this. That adult might have children and they take that message back to their kids. That right there is the biggest thing that somebody can do. And I actually teach about this. Next week, we have our representation week where I am talking all about how this matters. And we have seen this across industries, right? So I think we could actually look to television and movies to see ways that this makes a difference, right? There is a whole documentary on how Uhura from Star Trek was a role model to African American little girls at that time. Because she wasn't a side character, she was on the bridge, she was important. There was a speaking role. That was a game changer. And those types of things are important. In fact, there is a quote of Oprah saying that when she saw Uhura, that is what made her believe that she could also make it in media. Okay, so like these things matter. And like you said, BIPOC, all the genders, everybody plays games, right? Actually, the only big difference in demographics of who's playing is who you see. And so we have this idea that the people who play these types of games are white men, but that's not true. It's just that white men, white boys tend to play them publicly, whereas women and BIPOC folks tend to play less publicly, whether that's privately in their house or at friends' houses, but they tend to not play in the public spaces. So I think the big question we have to ask is why is that? Right. So representation is going to be very important for breaking that idea. And then the next thing is going to be to look at, why is that happening?
I agree that it's a question of perception in a lot of cases. And that similarly ties to the perception of professionalism, in that there are a lot of professional people in this space who are struggling to be seen as being professional. There are a lot of members of underrepresented groups in this space who we don't see represented, not because they're not here, but because there is a perception problem. And some of that is that people may not be as comfortable putting themselves out there. And so if you know people who are in the game space, whether as gamers or professionals who work in the industry, maybe they would become more comfortable participating more publicly. But also, search. Algorithms out there are going to feed you more of what you've already seen. If you have seen mainstream content, you're going to get more of it. Search for women in gaming. You will find them. You will find them. Ubisoft sponsored a female gaming team in 2004. They had an eSports team entered into tournaments in 2004. And this was a long time ago. I do not believe this team still exists. I do not believe that all of the efforts for this team have always been successful, but this is something that happened a long time ago and is not part of our narrative for this industry. It just isn't. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that these people aren't gamers. It doesn't mean they're not still gamers. It doesn't mean that they're not still part of this industry. It just means that we all see the content that most people see, and more of this content comes back to us. And we can help break that cycle by looking for new content, or by looking for the content that is out there that we weren't automatically served up.
Crystal Lee, I was going to bring it back to you, but you mentioned one of a term that I like to use in BIPOC. And so for those who might be unfamiliar, BIPOC is an acronym which stands for Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color, BIPOC. And I think that's a great way to frame this, the inclusivity of those who are playing games and making that transition from those who are playing to, and I like Erica, you said, those who are being seen. We want more gamers, we want more BIPOC representation to be seen, because then that can actually start to change some of this narrative. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So please, Crystal Lee, please come back in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as an example that I kind of forgot, but Erica mentioned the all women esports team Ubisoft, and I believe you're talking about the Frag Dolls.
I am talking
who
about
I was following as an undergrad, and that made a difference to me personally, right? Like I heard about this team when I was just thinking about going to grad school. I had just started thinking about researching games, which I hadn't thought of before because I only knew guys who played, guys who didn't always let me play. I remember trying to learn Magic the Gathering and being told that girls don't play, and they didn't let me. Um, and I don't even remember how I came across the frag dolls, but I came across them and I was just like, oh my God, there's like a whole group of them and they're all playing video games, right? Like this was amazing to me.
And Wendell, I would love to hear your thoughts on how can we help to change this perception, whether it's the perception that, girls don't play, that's not, gaming is not what girls do, or the perception of, you know, gaming is what you do when you are taking time out from learning. All right, it's a kind of a recess kind of activity, but when it's time to get serious, it's time to start learning and put the games away.
It's actually multi-level. I'm glad you bring that up because it also makes me think about some very poignant experiences I've had in my own life, in my own house. So I said the first step is in our own home. Okay. So I remember this, my son is now a freshman in Iowa. When he was coming up through high school, the conversation was always like, get off the damn games. Right. And it was usually, quite frankly, I put my wife out in this one because I would say, hey, he's a 4.0 student. Just let him do whatever he wants to do. At the same time, though, right, I've got friends like Tariq saying, hey, don't discourage. Here's what's happening. Now, a few years later, my middle school student, female, as my wife would say, she's gender fluid, right, and doesn't relate to things that girls are supposed to do, right? She wants to be the quarterback on the football team, right? Not that she is, she's like, I'm a female. I like boys. I like things that girls like, and I like things that girls don't like as well. Don't bother me about what these terms are, right? Because she would say, would you like a gaming system? Yes, I'd love a PS5 so I can do some different things that you can't do on Nintendo Switch because I want to do other games. I want to do other things and I want to experiment. So it starts at home first in that level. Secondarily, right, it has been interesting with, pre coming to the district as both COO and now this role on the foundation side, I ran a car loan program that was national that had a component of financial literacy. Interestingly enough, what did they use to capture young people and or adults in that financial literacy component? A game. You create an avatar and you navigate through the game. And instead of thinking a 2-hour seminar to talk about financial education, which is about as boring as it comes, right? Using the game and the avatar to spur on your teaching because it's real time. And it was implemented with real world implications.
This has been so fun, and I knew we would run short on time because I could keep talking to this. I could keep talking to each of you all day long. But Wendell, that was a great kind of loop back to what Erica said in the beginning. And so as we kind of go through our final round question, Erica, you had talked about earlier that there are so many disciplines. It's not just your math, your physics, your your biology, your chemistry, some of your quote unquote hard sciences. Part of the intrigue in gaming is the problem solving and learning how to think critically. You brought that up in one of your first comments. So since Wendell just talked about that, I'll give you the opportunity to, in our final round, where do you see that going? So let's say we take that philosophy and we look at gaming as problem solving. Where do you see the future of, we call it still really just education and gaming? How do you think these two fields can more closely align, and kind of where do you see things in 5 to 10 years?
I think one of the most important things that we have talked about so many times is just the growing awareness that is starting, but it's starting later in people's lives and careers. It would be great if it starts earlier. The growing awareness of how many opportunities exist in the games industry. So many people who, when they're young, are interested in games, think, I want to make games or I want to play games. And those are kind of very distinct things in their minds, and they don't realize how many other types of roles exist in these in the aura of those ideas. And a greater understanding of all those opportunities, all those branching paths would help people from a younger age understand that whatever their skills are, they can use them and they can develop them and find a way to use them in the game space. And then I think additionally, how I see, those problem solvers, those people who develop their root cause analysis in whatever field it may be, with that goal of moving into the game space. Over the next several years, I anticipate growing relationships among and between education institutions and businesses, but especially via alliances like Brandon's, where these alliances provide community for everyone who has this shared interest. And some of those people may choose to move into this as a career, profession, look for those branching paths of roles, and some people may stay in it as an industry and just a passion, a hobby. They may pursue eSports for their own gains, and it might not be a career that they're aligning with a company. But having that sort of alliance as a hub that can build connections with employers and with education institutions and provide this backbone of community, and growing that over time to have these young people who grow their root cause analysis, love learning, love games, bring it all together, come together themselves into community, and then see that there are so many options to move forward. I see that, and I hope to see that develop in the coming years.
Well, when you talk about gaming and community, hey, there's no community like the Milwaukee eSports Alliance in this region. So, Brandon, your final thoughts about kind of what you see as the future state and where we're moving with gaming and education.
To me, I think Erica said it really well, and I'll be really interested to hear, everyone else kind of opine on it. I think that the cool part is gaming is fun. That's always what excites me the most, is like, this is a fun thing. As an adult, as a youth, there's a component of this that just makes it interesting to do. And so as I look to the future, I really have always been very bullish on its role in society. I comically believe, if you're a futurist, that in 200 years, what we're talking about today will just be an absolute fabric of existence on this or whatever planet at that point, because we're creating digital environments for people to be able to be free and to learn and to try things in a totally unique and augmented way. And I think that's really cool. I think with that will need to come balance. Wendell, I'm reminded of your story of your kids and others I hear so often from people with kids right in that space. I was with someone last night at the Bucks game who has a 10-year-old, and he's like, I just don't get it. And there's a lot of fear in parents for this reason. And so I think, having people with some expertise or some base in the space is going to be important to really drive its adoption and sort of acceptance. But I do think of it as an eventuality just because of the cool nature of it. And I'll just say one thing as we continue on this dialogue, but I was really, it meant a lot when I think that both Crystalia and Erica were talking about representation and who you see. And I wanted to share some stats, just 3 things real quickly that I have found very impactful to me recently, shared by Marcus Howard, who's a gentleman down south who's doing some really cool esports work. 97% of US kids between ages 12 and 17 play video games. That one's fairly well known. The average gamer in the US is 31 years old and 45% are women. And that the African-American community is the largest consumer of gaming in the US. Like, those 3 things I find to be really representative of what we are describing. And so I thought it was pertinent to mention to the audience that's watching today, and just to reinforce that this narrative is out there and that it's an incredibly diverse and expansive universe. And so, yes, scholastic gaming and education will grow as an eventuality, but I just wanted to touch on that point, that really cool story, and that everybody's out there kind of enjoying themselves.
Crystalia, as a trained academic, and a lot of times people don't believe anything unless someone with a D at the end says it. So as a trained academic who is in higher ed, what are your thoughts, and how do you think you and the higher ed space can play a role in pushing gaming and education forward?
I think the number one important thing that, like, as a culture, we need to get over is the idea that games and learning are antithetical, because they are not. other stats that we could include in here is that people who game have a higher than average intelligence. You can't successfully play games if you're not intelligent. They're hard. There's puzzles, there's problem solving, there's all these things, there's critical thinking that is involved. All of these things that we want to teach our kids in school that they are practicing in games. So why would you tell them to not stop practicing? That seems
Hmm.
antithetical to learning, right? I actually teach an entire semester class called Video Games and Learning where I use 0 educational games. I use Witcher, I use Assassin's Creed, I just used Gone Home earlier today to go through all of these things that people learn um, in school. And I even use, just as an example, video games to teach anthropology. My PhD is actually in anthropology, it's not in games. And a lot of people thought that was really weird. And I'm like, why is it weird? We have all of these things that are being taught in games that are basically tricking players, like what Wendell said earlier about tricking people. People learn a lot without even realizing it, right? Like you learn some actual advanced economic principles playing FIFA, for example. Um, and so I really think that we should encourage people to think about what they're playing. So rather than playing less, because people learn these things and don't realize they're learning them, what if we just had conversations about like, oh, well, you're playing FIFA. Well, what do you think about whatever, right? Like have your students play FIFA for homework instead. And then when they come back to class on Monday, say, so what did you learn about supply and demand today?
Love that. And as an economics major, I really love that. And so if we can incorporate more of the gaming into our standard curricula, I think that can produce, I think, some better outcomes. Wendell, we will give you the last word on this panel. What do you see in the future, gaming and education, and kind of where do we go?
So, well, one, I think I'm inspired by all three of you in this conversation because what I see is the need to attach, professionals like yourselves into our system, right? In every facet. So every stakeholder, whether it be teachers, administrators, parents, and students, right? And then other stakeholders we've got with other industries to talk about if you really want to build your talent pipeline for tomorrow, there's different methodologies to do it, and this is definitely one. So as Crystal Lee said, I think even thinking about less of even tricking to some degree, and like how you used it as well, but can we think about this as how about going to school to actually have fun for once? So, can we do things a little bit differently instead of the same, unfortunately, 1850 construct that most of the districts are still utilizing with tiny bits of inspiration and innovation. So, a Brandon coming in and talking with parents and talking with teachers might inspire them to think a little bit differently. Crystal Lee and Erica coming in talking about the representation piece is big, especially for our girls that are tired of kind of being given some of the same things. And I think we've got to push the envelope much more. And that really happens with our external stakeholders and partners. They could come in and kind of reframe everything for us. So to me, it's how can I replicate more of myself to get to more of you all and get you in our buildings and with our parents and teachers, because I think the world is wide open for a lot of our students, but we've really got to just, we're just scratching the surface. And, every day we wait, we're missing more students. So we've got to get to them sooner.
Love it. And as we wrap up the panel, one of the ways is gaming is not just an enabler, it can also be a destination. Yes, it can enable education outcomes. It can enable better learning, but it can also be an outcome. You can get jobs. And as our parents always said, and they got it from their parents, you want to get you a good job. Well, there are a lot of good jobs. Erica can attest to it in gaming. And so Brandon can attest to it. So we want to make sure that people don't look at gaming as just some isolated fun thing that is disconnected from everything else. It's an enabler to a lot of things. And so thank you, Wendell, Brandon, Dr. Crystal Lee Malone, Erica. Thank you all so much for sharing your expertise, sharing your experiences. And we hope to see more alignment and interaction in this STEM education and gaming field. Thank you.